Thank you. All right. CSS afternoon. Yeah. We're back from lunch. You're all at the top of your energy curve. Totally focused. Right, I'll try to keep you awake. How's that? But as always, more coffee if necessary. Okay, so I'm really looking forward to this because I'm going to talk about something that doesn't get a lot of talking about, in my opinion, which is to say, generated content. Now, how many of you are generating content? Not generating content this way, but like actually using the generated content. See, I don't, like before and after, I don't see hands going up. If I say before and after, does that help? Yeah, that's what we're talking about, is generated content before and after, okay? That's what I want to talk about today because I think sometimes we don't really think about this, right? We've got this before thing and this after thing, and we use them for things, but like, what are they really, right? And that's what I want to dive into, and along the way, hopefully, I think I'll show a trick or two that you may not have seen before, and for those of you who haven't really thought about generated content, hopefully I can illuminate what these are and point the way to how you can use them maybe more effectively. So, before and after. These are pseudo elements, which is to say they're sort of elements, pseudo and sort of, right? They're elements, but not really. Or actually, they're not really elements, but they act a little bit like elements. This is, they tend to get lumped together with these pseudo classes, like hover and focus, but they're very different things. What they share in common is that hover and focus act like, sort of like you're dynamically assigning and taking away classes. So the hover pseudo classes, if the mouse pointer is over a thing, it is being hovered, and so CSS treats it as though there's a temporary hover class being applied there, and then styles can be applied as a result, and then when the mouse pointer moves away, not hovered anymore. Okay, so before and after, these pseudo elements are sort of like that in that they act like a new element has been shoved into the DOM, even though there isn't really one there, which leads to some weirdness, and that's part of what I'm going to talk about today. What I particularly like, because I'm a fan of, kind of an aficionado of layers of meta-ness, is that in the specification for pseudo elements, at the beginning of each section, there is a pseudo element. It's that. That symbol is inserted using this style, basically, boiled down. Every A that has a class of self-link that is the child of an element that has a class of heading, before that, put in some content, and that content is Unicode 00A7, the section sign. That comment doesn't appear in the source. I added that for clarity's sake. So that's actually part of a style sheet that is being used in more and more specifications. So before and after, right? And one of the syntactical distinctions that is made now is the two colons before, and before, after. Did you follow me there? Yeah, okay. Whereas hover and focus and so on only use one colon. Now, those of you who are as old as I am may remember that before and after used to have a single colon, just like the pseudo classes. And for backwards compatibility reasons, if you miss one of these colons, so if you just do colon after instead of colon after, browsers will still parse it because there are a whole bunch of old style sheets out there that have the single colon syntax, and so browsers have to be backwards compatible. They have to support that. But for clarity's sake, starting with, I think it was CSS 2.1, but it might have been whatever generated content specification came after that, the working group said, okay, the pseudo element should actually have two colons, just to keep them apart from each other. And where these get used sometimes is for little touches. So as an example, you might have a block quote, We've been seeing block quotes today here and there in the talks. And here's another one, right? Pull quotes, in fact. Jeffrey was showing pull quotes in his pointer style guide. Before this pull quote, because you want it to stand out from the rest of the content, not only is it going to be larger maybe than the rest of the content, it's going to be italicized, but you might put a big old opening quote mark on it, right? Maybe at the top because that fits in better with the overall presentation of the content, or maybe move it over here. That part actually doesn't matter. The thing is, you can type this in directly in the content, in the CMS or the flat HTML files, whatever style it is you're using for that sort of thing. But it actually makes more sense for something like this, I would argue, that if you have a block quote and you, for the current design, says have a big old quote mark before it, but no closing quote, because for some reason there are designers in this world who don't have OCD. This always bugs me, but it's so common that I have to show it here, right? It makes a lot more sense to do this in the CSS and generate it. And you can do something like block quote after. Now, I'm not necessarily recommending that if you're going to have an opening quote that you do it as after, but you could, right? Or you might have the before would do the opening quote and the after would do the closing quote, whatever. I actually put this up as block quote after on this particular slide to make it look like, to show that before doesn't necessarily mean visually before, or after doesn't necessarily mean visually after. It doesn't have to. Anyway, so you could do something like this, where you say, hey, the content of this generated content is the curly quotes. And then I'm going to make it bigger, and I'm going to lower the opacity, and then a whole bunch more styles to take something that's after the content and move it before that I left out here, because yikes, right? And that gets applied to a structure something like this. It's a block quote, a couple of paragraphs. The question is, let's go to before. Let's assume before here instead of after. Where is that? Well, it's there. And if you look at that, you'll notice that it's before the first paragraph, but it's not before the block quote, right? It's actually a child of the block quote, or at least it's represented as such in the web inspector. But it's the first thing if it's a before. Right? And if there were an after, it would be the last thing right before the slash block quote. And that gives us some insight into how this sort of thing gets used, right? So from that structure, you end up with this sort of thing, which means that, and this is where it gets fun, if I say block quote, and then any element that's a first child, that's a child of the block quote, be deep pink, that will be that first paragraph, not the before, right? Because it's acting like an element. It's stuck there. You can see it in the inspector. It's sort of in the DOM tree, and yet it's not a part of the selector DOM tree. I can't select the before using first child. That's not an option, even though it looks like that should be the case. When you look in the inspector, it looks like, oh, the block quote starts, and there's a before, and then there's a paragraph. So if I need to select that paragraph, I can't use first child, but you can. You can use first child. That's what gets weird sometimes about this. And so in situations like this, you may have seen this in the past, or done this in the past. I'm not going to ask you to put up your hands. This is a safe space, and I don't want anyone to have to out themselves for having done this. Okay, I'll ask for one hand raise. Eric, have you ever done this? Yes. All right. I have done this kind of thing repeatedly, where you have a bunch of links to different kinds of files, or maybe all the links that point to external sites you need to style in some way. In this case, if it's a Microsoft Word document versus a PDF, I want to mark those one way or the other, and so use style something like this, right? Where after every element that has a that ends in PDF. Every A element whose href attribute ends in .pdf. After that, I want a PDF icon. But if it ends in docx, or I could have put it .doc as well, put in a Microsoft Word icon. Now here's the thing. Those of you who are sitting in the back may be less able to see this than the people in the front, but those icons, they're kind of grody. They're blurry and low resolution because they were made in order to fit with regular text. But then when I took this screenshot using Firefox's screenshot command line utility, I set it to like 2 or 3 times resolution in order to capture a much higher resolution screenshot, which means the text looks good, the icons look like crap. Which is the same sort of thing where if you had a bunch of these icons that were set up for 11 pixel text because your design was done in 2007 when 11 pixel text was a thing you couldn't argue the designer out of, and now it's 2019 and the text is bigger, it's set to the default or maybe even slightly larger than that. Like if you have these icons, they're either going to be too small for the text or they're going to look weird. So you say, that's not a problem. I will replace, let's say, the Microsoft Word icon with a much higher resolution image, and you get this. And here's the fun part. This screenshot was taken in Firefox. Okay? So it looks like that, and I threw in some borders so we could see where things are, right? This is the screenshot in Firefox. This is the screenshot in Chrome, which, as long as you're not turning borders on to the befores and afters, then nobody would, like none of your users would really care about that. They would care much more. They're like, what is this huge icon? What are you trying to tell me? Anyway, back to this. Okay, I threw that on there. And so you might think, oh, here's a thought. I could do ahref, : after, star, max height 100%, max width 100%. Sorry, no, that will not work because those are not elements. So I can't, because the after isn't really an element, because of the way the CSS syntax is written, I can't select things inside of it. It's not generating elements for me to select. It's bringing in content and inserting it. There's nothing there for me to hook onto. Like those aren't actual IMG elements or any other kind of element in there. So like I can't resize those if something like this happens. So instead, you may have seen or done something like this, where you, instead of having foreground images, which you can't size, you have background images, because now that we have background image sizing, you can size them, even though there's no element for you to hook onto. You say something like display inline block, blah, blah, like background, center, contain, and then have these things come into the background. Okay. And then here I've put a border on 2 pixel solid red in order to make it clear like where these things are. Awesome. Although notice that the after, for the links that don't have icons to display, there's still an after box there. I'm still generating that box on each of those links, whether or not there's anything visible to put into it, which can lead to weirdness. Just got to be careful about that. So, remember ClearFix? I'm not even going to ask you to put up your hands if you've ever used ClearFix, because, I mean, unless I needed a picture of an entire room where everybody literally had their hand up, I might do it. But yeah, we've all done ClearFix. One point or another, whether we wanted to or not. But for those of you who might be a little new to the game and don't remember exactly what the deal with ClearFix was, it was hey, everything is laid out using floats. And so when you float all of the children of an element, then it collapses to 0 height. And we don't want that. We want it to wrap around those children, so we use a ClearFix. You might think that this is on its way out. I have some source code to show you. This is from the source, this is from the HTML of Facebook. Can you count the clear fixes? Yeah, I'll do it for you. And that's just that part of Facebook's source, right? There's much more to this source, and there are just clear fixes all the way through it, because utility CSS leads to more efficient markup, is what I hear. Anyway, there's clear fixes all over this thing. But here's why clearfix worked. Because it was generating an element box, which then you could clear below the other elements that were also generating boxes. So in a lot of cases, like this is sort of the most recent version of clearfix that I could find, which is the first 3 declarations there. The content, quote, quote, display table clear both. That was sort of the last, or like I say, the most recent version of clearfix that I found. The border and the padding are things that I added so that we could get this box to show where that clearfix pseudo element is showing up and why it was dragging the container height down. So it was effectively doing this, although I put table like it shows there in italics because it's not really a table. It's a thing that has display table, so it acts like a table in terms of rendering, and it would be collapsed down to no width because that's how table boxes act by default. If we took that table, a display table, and changed it to be instead display block, right? Without changing the CSS, the behavior there changes. It goes all the way across the box that's generated there instead of being just as, basically have 0 width. Now, does it matter? Not really. But it does point to what's happening here. There's a thing being shoved in there that acts like an element even though it's not really an element. And it can be styled like an element even though it's not really an element. And right, that's how clearfix worked. So yeah, who cares? Why does that matter? Well, you can do a lot of interesting things with this knowledge, knowing that, hey, this is a way for me to insert sort of a generic styling thing or stylable thing. So, as an example, you might have a website. It might be a website about getting better sleep, right? You worked for whoever it is that does the Sleep Number, who I just blanked on their name. Or you work for a mattress firm or whatever, right? So you have to manage content for this site. And for example, you'd have an article about corduroy pillows. So the designer might say, you know what, and the designer might be you, to be clear about that, might say, it would be nice if we could take the headline and the subhead and sort of separate them a little bit visually from the main content. Cool, so let's put in a horizontal rule. HR, oh, yeah. Moving on. Oh, wait, no, that's it's gray and it doesn't really fit in with the rest of the stuff. Maybe we won't do that. Maybe instead of an HR, we could do, after the header element, a little bit of header after. Content, quote, quote, which is, there has to be some, quote, space quote, there has to be some content generally in order to make that piece appear, but then you can say display block so that it stretches across. Say width 100% just to be sure, give it some height, and then I threw in a couple of outlines so we could actually see what's happening here. All right, so instead of an HR, we've got this. Well, what can we do with that? Well, inside of there, maybe put in a linear gradient background, okay? Such that it does that. So instead of just being this line, it's a line that fades out towards the sides. Or maybe instead of fading out towards both sides, it actually starts out solid on the left and fades out as it goes towards the right. Right? Like, it's hard to say which of these would be better without knowing what the rest of the design looks like, but these are various alternatives for this. You could even flip it around, right? So that instead of being solid and going to fade out in left to right, it goes the other way. It fades in until it's solid on the side, which again might fit in with the rest of the design, and it might not. But it's kind of fun doing this, and I've started doing this on a more regular basis over the last couple of years, because there's so much you can do in here with just a few gradients, right? And I wanted to sort of illustrate more clearly how I was doing what I was doing. Let me make these taller first, right? So that's what each of those gradients looks like. And you might have done gradients in the past, but as an example, that first one there goes to the right. It goes from DDD to 000 to DDD. I used opaque colors rather than translucent colors, but you could absolutely use RGBA or hexadecimal alpha values, whatever you want here, so that the fades actually blend with the background, but it was just easier to do opaque here. And then this one is to the right, goes from 000 to DDD. But in that midpoint there, like halfway between the two is the midpoint between those two values, which turns out to be 6F, 6F, 6F. But in this last one, I threw in a color stop, basically a color easing stop. So between the DDD and the 000, I said, I want that midpoint actually to be at 67% of the distance between these two color stops. If you throw in like this, if you have a percentage or a length, you can set the position of the midpoint between the two colors in the two color stops. And then there's an algorithm that's used to ease the transition from one to the other, making sure that midpoint happens at the point that you specified. The algorithm for doing that easing is the same one Photoshop uses. I will leave it as an exercise to the audience to determine how that exact algorithm ended up in the CSS specification, but that is what it is. So if you're used to how gradients work in Photoshop, with the color, the midpoint being shifted from the 50%, that's how they're going to work in here. Awesome. So we can do that sort of thing. Like we could go from, and in this case I'm using transparent, I could say from the right, go from a red to transparent, stay transparent, and then go back to the red, and then I get something like this. And notice that this is 3 pixels tall, is 100% wide and 3 pixels tall, and then over that, I can put a 1 pixel tall gradient that's more opaque, and so not only does it fade, but it looks like it's narrowing and widening, because it kind of is, right? And then, okay, that's kind of cool, but let's take it further. Let's use a radial gradient and put that right in the middle. Now I have a separator. I'm like building my own custom horizontal rule. Remember well, some of you won't remember this, but remember the rest of you way back in the day when there were entire sites devoted to like GIF animated horizontal rules that had flames or like those jumping unicorns or whatever, and you would download them and put them on your site? Some of you don't remember that. I can see some people out there like, what? Why would, what? That's for real. Whole gallery pages of animated horizontal rules. It was the bomb. But yeah, but that's, I'm building one here for myself. And then, having done this circle in the middle, I might decide, actually, you know what? Let me put an SVG in there, and then I'll put a couple of radial gradients in so that it looks like I put the bread in brackets. Because remember, this is a site for the sleep number system or whatever site that we're working on here. All right, so there's an SVG of a bed. Could be a PNG or a GIF or a JPEG or whatever. XBM if you want to rock it old school. And then underneath that, an opaque white circle, and then underneath that a slightly larger opaque red circle, and then beneath those the linear gradients that set up that thing. Or if I don't want brackets, if I want actual full circles, I just make this taller, change it to 2M, and get that. I can have branded separators. In fact, I've done this for an event apart, except instead of a bed, I used the little laurel leaf, right? I've done this sort of thing, and it works fine. And thanks to progressive enhancement, if for some reason this doesn't work, it's not that big a deal, right? It's a nice decorative touch. And speaking of old school and gallery pages with animated GIFs, you could even use your generated content to do this. I decided not to include the CSS to have the two animated shoveling guys on the sides. But if you want to do that, I'll leave that up to you. But this does, there was a point I wanted to make about this, which is a thing that trips me up. And so I try to include it when I'm talking about multiple backgrounds, which is the order that the multiple backgrounds are in is basically the same as in a Photoshop palette. I took that screenshot in Photoshop CS3. Just to keep up the historical references. But this always gets me. Multiple backgrounds are listed front to back. I always think, and I literally, while I was creating this talk at the beginning of the year, I made this mistake where I said, okay, I've got a background, and now I need a background, I need a smaller background on top of it, so I'm going to put it afterwards, because in CSS, the thing that comes last is the thing that went, oh no, that's not how it works here, right? That instinct of, if I want to overwrite a thing that I did, I write it later, it's reversed here. It's in the order, the same order that the layers palette would be in something like Photoshop or Sketch or Figma or whatever else. The stuff that's first is the stuff on top. So just, if you ever have multiple backgrounds and you can't figure out why the background you just added isn't showing on top of the background you had before, you can think back to this and say, that's right, Eric mentioned that he does this same thing. Let me make sure I didn't accidentally put it after instead of before. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. So you can use this sort of technique to make design tools. Okay, I don't mean necessarily the under construction banners, although if that to you is a design tool, then go for it. I'm all there for you. Okay, but instead of doing something like this, right? Maybe you could do something like this. Look up there in the upper left-hand corner, where basically at each of my media query trigger points, I can use generated content at the beginning of the body to say, or at the beginning of the HTML element, to show what that is. So during development, this is not something I usually push to production, but during development, I can remind myself as I'm doing my responsive testing, oh, this is what happens, like this is what's happening here and it's wrong. What breakpoint am I in? Like where do I need to go to look for the fix? Right? Or across which breakpoints do I have this particular problem? Does this problem happen right before I hit the next breakpoint? Because not every breakpoint is obvious. Right? It might be as simple, depending on what kinds of breakpoints you have, but I've worked on projects where some of the breakpoints literally were just changing the font size of certain elements throughout the design because there was a much finer control than usual. So I find this really useful just to remind myself during development. And I can, they can be all in one place like they are here, or literally at every breakpoint, just literally the first thing is HTML before content, 40M. And obviously you don't have to just reproduce what the media query is. You can label these whatever will work for you. If your project has internal code names for each of the breakpoints, they could be, mobile, tablet, desktop, because that's what the designer designed to. Okay, fine, use those as your labels. You can call them Bob, Steve, and Joe if that's gonna work for you, whatever it is. So I find that really useful. In this case, pretty sure I'm absolutely positioning them into the top left corner so that even if I scroll, or sorry, fixed positioning them, not absolutely, fixed positioning them at the top left corner. So even if I'm scrolling on a page, I can still see which breakpoint I'm in. But again, do it your way. And this is one that I actually I found useful on a project. It was a little while ago. But I find this useful particularly for if you need to share the design process with people who aren't necessarily familiar with design processes. So in this example, I've got a bunch of divs with various IDs. They could be mains and sections, and the div with an ID of main probably should be a main element. That's not exactly the point here. The point is that each of these has an ID. And what I could do with generated content is before each of them, I could actually put in the name of the ID, right? By saying content ATTR ID, what that means is the content of this is the value of the attribute ID. So if you look at the masthead there, instead of just saying logo tagline, now it says masthead logo tagline because it pulled that ID value and jammed it in there. You know, maybe add a little bit of style so that it's more obvious what's going on there. But some of you might look at this and think, geez, Eric, way to rip off Firebug. This is exactly how Firebug did what it did. In Firebug, when you said show me the IDs or show me the classes, it was using generated content and just sticking them in there. Go Firebug, right? So, okay, if I want to sort of revisit the Firebug way of doing things, I could just leave it like this during my development. But this is about sharing with people outside of the process, people who might not have ever seen Firebug or know what Firebug is. Or if you say Firebug, they say, oh yeah, I read the Broken Earth trilogy too, that was amazing, right? It's like, yeah, but yes, it was, but not what I'm talking about here, right? So instead of putting them in little, putting the IDs in little boxes, I actually have those boxes stretched to cover the entire elements. And then give those elements a translucent background, a semi-transparent background. Okay, great. But it's a little weird that they're sitting up there in the corners now. So maybe I'll put them in the center by using Flexbox, because Flexbox makes vertical and horizontal centering easy, like so easy. I am literally starting to forget why the jokes about the most difficult problems in computer science include vertical centering and CSS. Like I see those jokes and I'm like, no, it's not. Oh, right. Yeah, it was for a long time, wasn't it? But okay, so I threw those in the center, but now they're really hard to see, so I think I'm going to make them bigger. And now that I've done that, the whole monospace thing isn't necessarily working for me, and I don't know. I don't really need the octothorpes anymore. Historical note, because clearly this is about a lot of history. The term octothorpe is because there are 8 points, and the Bell engineers who named the symbol were huge fans of the athlete Jim Thorpe. Sounds like I'm making it up. I am not. That is how that happened. Anyway, don't want to do the monospace anymore, and actually I don't know that I necessarily need the octothorpe, so I'm going to take those out, turn it to Georgia. All right. And if I want to set the text apart a little bit more from its background, just in case it's overlapping text, throw in some text shadowing, basically stacking a whole bunch of text shadows on top of each other. So I haven't done it yet. I'm going to bring them in. So like look closely at the main or the aside. Those are where it's going to show up the most. Okay, ready? Here it comes. You ready? Here it is. Yeah. Barely see anything, could you? And yet, still there. And it's weird how much of a difference it makes. I've done things where I add the text shadows and I think, wait, did I really do that? So I do a thing where on hover, it takes the text shadow away, and it's weird how much of a difference it makes. Anyway, so at this point, okay, that's kind of cool. And I could show this to, let's say, the manager above my manager's manager. who has seen the wireframes and wants to see how the progress is coming. And you say, well, here's a live prototype. And they're like, oh, exactly like the wireframes you showed me with the labels and everything. Thank you. Right? And if they're clued in enough to say, and is it responsive? You can show them how it responds, and all of the boxes keep their labels, and it's all, okay. But maybe your manager's manager looks at these and says, oh, these don't look quite like the wireframes that you were given. I don't see any X's. Okay. Well, first of all, let's do a little bit more of backmasking, which I'm going to do again here. Here it comes. Can't sort of see it with a radial gradient, just to give a sort of a more of a block out behind those labels. And then at this point, yeah, maybe probably the translucent yellow isn't necessarily doing it. You have people asking you why you're using Post-it notes. That kind of thing. So, all right, we'll turn that into a translucent white. And then at that point, what we can do is we can open up a little space and then bring in some SVGs. And now we got big X's. But wait, you say, I can hear it already, those X's look scrunchy. They're not consistent. And yes, that is true. The URL i/x.svg, which I'm throwing in there, this is what it looks like, and this is its source, at least at its most basic. Actually, no, this is its whole source, right? So this is the X, and there are some bits I did in here. Vector effect, non-scaling stroke. This is an SVG feature where you can tell it for a given line or a given path or a given whatever that the stroke width should not be scaled even if the thing is scaled or stretched or squished or whatever, right? So that whatever stroke width 2 means, if that's 2 pixels or 2, I don't know what's, in the SVG coordinate system, whenever that line is drawn, it will always be too wide, even if the thing that it relates to has been squished down or whatever. Firefox does not support that, or at least did not as of the last I checked, and that was pretty recently, even in the nightlies. But Chrome does, so, right? But if you're using this to share with other people, generally you can control the browser you're going to show it to them in. But the reason that I just flipped the masks there is that if you're looking closely, the Chrome screenshot is much more stair-steppy and pixelated than the Firefox screenshot, because Firefox supports high-resolution screen capture, and Chrome, so far as I can tell, doesn't. So you can use this for this sort of thing for also automating design touches, stuff that will not be part of just the internal design process, but actually ship to production. So this is an example I pulled from my own website. I occasionally have code blocks. And some of those code blocks have classes that indicate what language is inside those pre-elements, right? So this bit of CSS is, this bit of pre-formatted text is contains some stuff that's supposed to be CSS, so I have a class of CSS. I only started doing this in the last few years, so I have a whole bunch of code blocks before this that have no classes along these lines, but that's okay for reasons that I hope will become clear very quickly. But what I started doing was I started adding a bunch of CSS to automatically fill in a label that says, hey, this is CSS, right? Using generated content. Throw in the value of the class attribute, display block, padding, background, color, et cetera, give it this font at this size with this face, text align center, text transform uppercase, just in case all my classes are lowercased, that sort of thing, because I know that I'm going to be using it for this sort of situation. Now, it's a lot harder to see on the projector, but if you've got the PDF, you can tell that the label isn't really where it needs to be. It's away from the edges of the pre, and it needs to get moved up and out to those edges. So with some negative margins, that can happen. This is one of many ways to do this, right? So just pull it upwards and outwards using negative top margin and some negative side margins, but remember to have the positive bottom margin, otherwise the text, the actual text content will get jammed up against the generated content box that I created here. Okay, so that's a way to do that. Could also use positioning, but then you got to remember to have some top padding on the pre-element so that, again, you don't have overlap between the position generated content and the regular content. But having it across the top felt kind of pedestrian to me, I have to be honest. So rather than a right 0, I did a bottom 0, which started me out here, not necessarily where I wanted to end up, but I changed the writing mode to vertical RL, which is vertical right to left. So vertical right to left. Okay. Except I wanted the text to be the other way, right? I want it to be flipped. So I flipped it by transforming or rotating it 180 degrees. Done. Okay, cool. And now I can do more complicated stuff. Instead of just putting in the attribute class, if I know that if I have CSS, I could actually put curly braces around it. And if it's HTML, I can put angle brackets. And if it's JavaScript, I can do whatever that is. Or not, I could just have it automatically inject the class attribute value and leave it at that. Why this, why this works as it is for me is that if I want, like I say, if I want for a specific language to do something a little bit more, I can do it like this. And then if I have code blocks of PHP, let's say, it'll still, the CSS that I wrote before will still put PHP, it just won't have extra stuff around it. Thanks to pre-before content attribute class. Cool, all right. So that automates that, right? Like as I go through, I don't have to really think about how I'm gonna, I don't have to put extra elements inside my pre's to say, hey, I want you to label this as HTML. I'm classing these things anyway. Just use the class and it'll happen automatically. And then if I ever decide, you know what, I really don't like these sideways labels, I'd rather do something else, all I have to do is rewrite the CSS. And instead of positioning and all that, I could use grid, because that's the thing, and this is actually one of the important points here. The pseudo element, which cannot be selected directly and does not generate actual elements in the DOM tree, is still treated by Flexbox as a flex item and by grid layout as a grid item. So if I say display grid, template columns, et cetera, min content 1FR, and I'm not going to get into what all of that means. Rachel and Jen will more than capably handle that. But that before, that generated content box is treated as a grid item in the grid here. So if I turn on the Firefox Grid Inspector, which is what that screenshot shows, right, it's showing me that the first column contains that generated content box, which means that it's a grid item that got put into that first grid cell. And then there's a gap, there's grid gap between the first and second columns. And the second column is everything else basically. In this case, it's the text node, which here, Firefox Grid Inspector, woohoo! Great. So I might want that label to be a little bit taller, and I could do that using negative margin tricks like I did before. That will still work in a grid context. Or what I could do is make sure that if I'm doing this, I want my pre's to have a code element that wraps around the actual code, and then the generated content will come before that code element, and I can then style them effectively directly. I can take that code and say, okay, it's going to be this big, and it's going to have a margin of 1em top and bottom, which will then force the grid container to be bigger, and thus stretch that generated content label to be taller if I take out the negative top and bottom margin that I had before. Okay. And then, like I said, with the code element, I can say things like the font should inherit, and it can have a margin, and so on and so forth. And so, this sort of technique can be used for more than just labeling code blocks, because I'm going to guess that most of you do not manage websites that have code blocks. Probably. But this is taken from a design experiment that was done and ultimately not pursued for the Event Apart website, where we were thinking that for various news posts, each one would get a little box, and then they would have these sort of bookmark, or whatever you call those, but those little orange arrows in the corners that would identify a category, right? So the Event Apart 2018 playlist, this is in the listen category, and then resources from the event would be in the links, and the video would be in learn, because we were feeling very alliterative when we were doing this. Anyway, what could happen here, excuse me, is that we could use HTML data attributes to put in what category. So like listen, links, or learn. And then, using generated content, insert that attribute value. And then style it with the background color of orange and the foreground color of white. And there's actually clip path that's happening in order to make it point, which again I'm not going to get into here, but that's how that presentation was done, and then they were positioned into the corner, right? And with this, because all of this is coming out of a CMS, right, I can take that name of the category that the post belongs to, dynamically stick it into a data-cat attribute as the page is being generated, and then I don't have to worry about having those things show up. They'll just show up because I wrote CSS for it, right? Maybe some extra to make sure that they're capitalized, just in case somebody accidentally does a category name all lowercase. So that's all cool. And actually, just to be clear again, all that stuff gets injected, but if for some reason that doesn't work, let's say web browsers of the far future decide that they're not going to insert generated content anymore for some reason, but they're still mostly backwards compatible. Like, it might turn out the generated content is a security bug of some sort, which sounds ludicrous, but remember, the visited pseudo class was discovered to be a massive privacy and security hole, and that's why visited is weird, particularly if you try to script it. But again, not to get into that now, maybe it'll turn out that generated content in the future will be determined to be a big user privacy problem, and it's not going to be supported anymore. So if those go away, that's okay, right? They're design touches. Nothing's depending on them. But you might be saying to yourself, come on, clearly there's a downside here. Yes and no. Accessibility, you might think, is the real problem here. And Eric Eggert, who you may know as Yodel on Twitter, you may not, but either way, he very recently actually wrote this article about accessible CSS-generated content. And one of the points that he made was that we're used to thinking of generated content as a thing that screen readers ignore. But it is not, because browsers would ignore the generated content as real content, so screen readers couldn't get to it. But developers didn't really intend that. So now, browsers treat generated content as actual content. So if you are generating text content, it will be read, most likely, by screen readers. Now, it's not as simple as that binary choice. I don't know how many of you have experience with screen readers, but there are a lot of them, it turns out, and they have a lot of different behaviors. But let's start with a simple case. So in this article, Eric talked about a link, basically this link, where there's a link to a report that's in PDF format, and you want any link that is a link to a PDF to have after it generated content of PDF in parentheses. So that ideally what's going to happen here from this markup is that the user is going to see get the report PDF. But then what's going to happen with the screen reader? Will the screen reader say get the report PDF? Well, I actually got recordings from NV Access, NVDA, VoiceOver, and JAWS, and they all read get the report PDF in one sense or another. JAWS actually says get the report open parenthesis PDF close parenthesis, or at least the version of JAWS that was used to record the audio file that I got did that. But they all read it, okay? One of the points that Eric makes in his article is that if you want to be sure of what screen readers are going to read, a thing to look at is the Aria label attribute. Now, in this case, this is repetitive, right? Because my intended visual rendering is get the report PDF, and I would hope that that would be the same Aria reading. So saying Aria label get the report PDF is going a little bit far here, but if I wanted the Aria label, if I wanted screen readers to actually say get the report linked to a PDF file, right? I don't want that visually, but that's what I want a screen reader to do, because you know, in user testing I discovered that that's more accessible to the users of my site, or that just seems better for whatever reason. You can use Aria label to effectively override the content of the element that's to be read out. And this also was supported by all 3 of the browsers that I tested, with one proviso. In older macOS versions, VoiceOver doesn't do this correctly. Here, in fact, is what VoiceOver, in older versions of macOS, will do.
Link, get the report PDF.
That's what it does. It reads the content, ignores the generated content, and then reads the Aria label. It doesn't just read the Aria label. It reads the actual text content and then the Aria label, which was not the experience that I was hoping for. But like I say, that's, like El Capitan is where that happens. In the current version of macOS, that's not what happens. It will read the Aria label, just the Aria label, if the said label exists. If not, it will read the content plus the generated content just as in one shot. But I bring this up because a lot of assistive technology tends to be older versions of things, because once someone who really needs assistive technology gets a setup that works for them, they will be very loath to change it. So this is something that you really need to think about if you're going to be using generated content for actual text, inserting actual text. If you're using it to generate cool HRs, like cool separators, this is not a thing you're going to have to worry about. But if you're actually putting in text, this is a thing you got to think about. Whether or not you want that generated content read or not read, it's still something you have to worry about. Okay, and I know I only showed you 3 browsers. This is a list of screen readers from Wikipedia from actually late last week. This is the list, right? including screen readers. There's actually a small block in there of screen readers that were under development but were discontinued. But regardless, this is both current and legacy screen readers, and those are the ones that Wikipedia lists. That doesn't necessarily mean it's every single one in the world. So again, if you're going to be generating text, actual text content, you need to be careful about what you're doing and step up your user testing in this, particularly in this area. As many, if you can identify any users who use assistive technology, right? Do like Sarah was talking about, like identify them, offer them a $30 gift certificate to Starbucks or whatever it is that will help them help you. And it could literally just be, hey, can you record you using our site and send us the file? Or can we get together and do a video chat thing and we'll record on this end, like totally be upfront about the fact you'll be recording because we want to understand what it's like for you. Anyway. And Steve Faulkner, not too long ago, published this super short note on CSS text, as it says, where he talks about, why does CSS text get announced by screen readers, but I found this interesting. Sometimes symbols or punctuation marks don't get announced as in CSS generated text or generated content, as I've been referring to it here. And I include this, and there's a link in the resources page for the show to this article, but I include this because of this screenshots. This is from NVDA, which is the screen reader by NV Access. It's free to download and use. And this is just a small part of the preferences for symbol pronunciation in English. A user of NV Access can go in and decide whether or not a sentence ending question mark should be announced as such or not. Right, so that, to be or not to be question mark could literally be the behavior that one person has configured, whereas someone else would be to be or not to be. And that they wouldn't say question mark, which is why I said earlier when I got the NVDA recording of reading out the get a link, get the report PDF. The recording I got was get the report open parenthesis PDF close parenthesis, but there's a way to have it not do that. So when it comes to text, inserting text, you need to think before you style, all right? So that's not necessarily a down note, I hope, so much as a word of warning, because as with so many other things, should I use this? The answer is it depends. So much of our field, the answer to should I do X or Y is it depends. And this is one of those areas. But I hope that whatever your understanding of generated content was before I got up here on stage, you'll have a better understanding and a more open mind to using it after I got up here. So with that, I will say thank you very much for your time and your attention.